Hello and welcome to Morgan Meets the Eye. My name is Evan Morgan and I'm the host of this series. First things first, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I do want to encourage you to follow me on social media. My Twitter handle is @NotSpicedRum and my Instagram handle is @SomeGuyNamedMorgan. So make sure to subscribe to my YouTube page and certainly keep up with this show on Apple, Spotify, or upon whichever streaming platforms it is available. So my guest for today is MentisWave, a YouTuber known for his right-leaning, libertarian, rationalist content, and his videos call for independent thought as well as a distrust for centralized government. And I would recommend that any leftist with a misguided grudge against libertarianism definitely visit his channel for some immediate deprogramming. So with that said, MentisWave, thanks for coming on the show, and where can listeners go to check out your work?
Hey there, yep. I am MentisWave, and the probably best way to just find my work is just Google MentisWave, and I'm usually right at the top there. But if you can't find it that way, it would just be the MentisWave in YouTube. So, or the @MentisWave handle there. I've got that since YouTube changed the whole handling system about a few months ago. So now we actually have an @ symbol.
So just starting off, just jumping right into this, how would you describe your belief system, probably in the most precise way that you could?
The fastest way to say it is I'm a right-leaning libertarian that likes hop. And, of course, people in that camp know that basically just means Austro-libertarian with a thing for anarcho-capitalism and all that.
And basically, to clear up any misconception, what would you say? What does libertarianism really mean? Because from the readings I've done, there are naturally some slight differences between what people mean by this exactly. But the general consensus that I've seen across the board is that it really comes down to minimal state intervention in society. And what I've noticed about this definition is it explains, what is not liberty, the state. But what would you say it really comes down to, specifically?
It really just comes down to maximizing personal freedom through decentralizing the government, because a lot of people have a misconception of anarcho-capitalism and what a lot of things that coming out of the Mises Institute and Austrian economics actually mean. A lot of times when people hear the word anarcho-capitalism or any kinds of form of anarchy, they immediately flip out because we kind of don't have a very good definition of what that means. They hear the word anarchy and they immediately assume, oh, that means no rules, no laws, no courts, no justice, and corporations can just do whatever they want. And that's not really the case at all. In reality, there's things like the Mechanisms of Freedom of Every Knot. That's a pretty good book to read. And also Hobbes' idea of privatized cities. There would still be things like rules and courts and whatnot and what have you, and justice. It would just be decentralized. It would just be privatized. So really what anarcho-capitalism actually means is breaking up various parts of the government that currently exist, effectively just taking away the monopoly of the state. Because that's the actual problem that we have identified that everyone's just kind of gleans over. Because most people understand that, yes, monopolies are bad. And we understand that for corporations. But in our infinite insanity, we've decided, okay, well, let's just give a pass to the state. Let's just let them do whatever they want. And we've kind of realized that, oh, wait a minute, that actually doesn't make any sense. We actually could privatize these and have a decentralized form of rule. And so what that comes down to is we're trying to maximize the freedom of association. Because, yes, there will still be bad corporations. That's one thing that we kind of have not on our side, is that we're being honest with people. A lot of times people get sucked into other sort of camps of philosophy and politics because those camps lie to them. They claim to have utopia, whereas we're not claiming to have utopia. Socialists bring a whole lot of people to their side because they're like, oh, hey, come to us and believe what we believe, and free stuff, man. Scarcity will magically not exist, man. And that's incredibly stupid if you understand economics and even the slightest, but it fools a lot of young people. It gets a lot of people on their side. They jump into it and they love it. And we basically just don't do that. We admit that, yes, there will be problems, there will be bad corporations, but you can freely disassociate with them, and therefore the worst corporations will actually be less successful, and that will actually lead to a better society and more free society and more effective and efficient economy overall.
Right. Very, very well said. I mean, it actually reminds me, I've seen some Murray Rothbard lectures as well, where he would be talking about how he would be, getting into debates with people who would say, because we have so many scarce resources, we really need to establish a socialist society. Then you would also talk to people who say that because we live in modern times where we've achieved a post-scarcity world, where everything is ultra abundant, we need to establish a socialist society. So everything seems to come back to socialism. So, I mean, I feel like
that's a no. We are not anywhere close to post-scarcity.
Right.
Not anywhere close. That's a pipe dream for now. I mean, maybe 50 years in the future, AI and robots might be able to get us there, but for now, we're still not anywhere there. And even then, in that happening, you'd still have just kind of the basic laws of physics, to be honest. The second law of thermodynamics kind of dictates that there will always be some form of scarcity. And the irony is that capitalism and free market policies are what's bringing us closer to no scarcity. So people who are saying like, okay, well, we've achieved a level of less scarcity that we like, so let's do socialism now. Well, they might actually, they are really shooting themselves in the foot. You could potentially end the scarcity. You could actually potentially dry up all that generational resources that we built up through free market policies. So that's definitely a bad idea from them.
Right. I know Hayek speaks on that in The Road to Serfdom, where he talks about how people are pushing for this new socialist, mindset at that time. And they didn't really question, the type of, economics that actually got them to this point in history in the first place. So essentially by pushing for socialism, they're essentially ignoring history, the common line of, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. But I mean, by ignoring it, they were essentially causing, they're putting themselves in jeopardy there. So basically, I've noticed that, a lot of people will respond to anarcho-capitalism. They'll criticize it on the grounds that it overlooks, the complexities of economic relations. And they say that it fails to find a quote unquote, reasonable balance as far as state involvement in, the social and economic affairs. So they'll say that essentially, we need a specific, the state to take place and be involved in antitrust economics, antitrust policy and things like that. And that by removing the state, by not having some type of barrier there, some type of, referee really in the marketplace, that's going to allow things to go crazy. Monopolies will form and all of that. And, obviously we've heard plenty of responses, as far as, from Rothbard as well as many others to why this is not really the case at all. But I just basically want to hear your take on that.
Yeah, that kind of brings us into the whole monopolies argument that I've kind of gone over a few times. That's mainly based kind of on a misconception of reason and a misconception of history. The whole the idea of a natural monopoly, first off, the math behind it is incorrect because it assumes that a certain sector of the economy will always stay the same. And that's just not true. We know that new technology people come up with new ideas, and there will always be, therefore, some kind of niche for people to find a way to compete. And also, the reality is natural monopolies, as it turns out, because of what I've just said, have never actually existed. There's a pretty good article on Mises that kind of explains that we actually haven't ever had a natural monopoly. And most people don't know that. Most people are actually very shocked to find out that this big fear that we get from economists about monopolies has never actually occurred. And people find that that's very strange. Why has that never happened? And well, the answer is because monopolies, they can really only exist permanently in the threat of force. That's the truth about monopolies. If there isn't that, then there will always be somebody to compete. Like, for instance, take big tech. Big tech's a very good example of this, because big tech does, to some degree, may seem like a natural monopoly in some ways, but they're actually not. Like, for instance, ask the question, what does big tech even have a monopoly over? Well, do they have a monopoly of service? Well, no, they don't have a monopoly of service at all. they have a monopoly of user bases, but they don't really have a monopoly of service. There's other places offering service, like for instance in YouTube. YouTube really only has a monopoly of user bases because they offer a good service. And then you have places like Rumble or BitChute or Odyssey effectively offering the same thing. So they don't actually have a monopoly. And what people don't realize about that is that just the existence of places like Odyssey, that makes it so YouTube can really only go so far in terms of bad policy decisions. Like, for instance, let's say YouTube were to come out and say, like, okay, we're going to ban any video at all that has any politics that aren't, like, aligned with the World Economic Forum. Just all politics that are not aligned with that mindset. We are going to now ban that. Your channel is not just demonetized, but your channel is just deleted off the face of all of Google servers. And what would happen if that were to occur is that Rumble servers would explode.
Right.
They would just be giving up their monopoly, because that means they've just screwed the politics of about something like 60% of users, because probably you got a small amount of centrists who'd be okay with that, and then you got leftists who'd be okay with that. But the reality is, like, every libertarian and every, like, moderate conservative, every classical liberal, just about basically everybody else would be like, wow, that's a really dumb idea. We're going to leave this platform now, and we're going to go, if we want to watch something with politics that actually aligns with our beliefs, we're going to go to Rumble, we're going to go to Odyssey, we're going to start seeking out other places. And so the reality is, simply the threat of competition keeps businesses in line. That's what a lot of people don't realize. So it's actually kind of okay for a monopoly to exist as long as you're allowing competition to potentially exist, even if they're just not really doing anything, even if they're just sitting in a little corner of the market and they only have maybe 1% of the user base. And this same thing can go for just anything. I'm just using YouTube as an example because we're here on YouTube right now. So, but this can apply to anything at all. They can just be sitting in their little corner, and just their threat that they could take over means that a corporation has to basically behave themselves if they want to keep what they have, because just the threat that they could lose it kind of enforces a sort of natural behavior set on them.
Right, exactly. Just their very existence, leaves the door open for, sometimes, threat to come in and take that, market share from them. So if they start making, these incredibly, counterintuitive decisions, like you're saying with the World Economic Forum, that is not the decision that somebody who's actually threatened by competition or somebody who's actually, susceptible to it would want to implement.
Exactly.
Right.
And then on the other side, it doesn't even have to be political. That's just one example. Like, another thing they could do is YouTube would come out and say, oh, well, in order to watch our service, it now costs $15 a month. Again, boom, everyone goes to Odyssey.
Yeah, it's right up there with them, just banning all videos that use the letter A in them or something.
Yeah, insert ridiculous bad idea here.
Right. And, so basically, I've noticed that a lot of your videos, seem to specialize in identifying a lot of these common fallacies that are thrown around. And they also address a lot of the groupthink and the brainwashing that goes on, in today's society. So basically in this episode, I want to kind of delve into a lot of these ideas and discuss where they're coming from and how we can respond to them. So basically the first one that came to my mind was, as you may have noticed, it seems as though there's been a lot of push for relativism, especially in terms of morality, within our society lately. And it seems to me that the leftist worldview seems to require just so many mental gymnastics just in order to hold it together. So to the left, for example, morality becomes such an extremely complicated, matter. I think this is done deliberately, that it eventually reaches the point where right and wrong become such nebulous ideas that they could really do anything and claim that it's justified. To give you an example, I know there's a Thomas Sowell quote out there, and I might be butchering this, but it was basically something along the lines of, have we finally reached the point of absurdity where people are being held responsible for what others did centuries ago, yet others are not held responsible for what they themselves are doing today? And this was referring to the subject of race, in the United States. So we can obviously recognize that this type of behavior is immoral, but if you dilute what morality and immorality themselves actually are, you can essentially present whatever flimsy rebuttal you want, to criticism you receive. And you could dismiss that simply because, this person you're arguing with is a bigot, or they don't know what it's like to be part of group X, or they simply just don't understand. So, and I feel like this is often used in a lot of, criticisms toward libertarianism as well. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on this push for relativism, and how do you think people should respond to it, when confronted with it?
Ah, yes, the Islam is right about women question. Mm-hmm. That's a good one. So, I mean, the issue of subjective morality is one of those things that philosophers themselves have been arguing about for basically thousands of years. It's not an easy subject. There aren't easy answers, but the most important thing that people seem to have forgotten, and you kind of just mentioned it while you were talking about it, the most important thing is both free association and not contradicting yourself. Because what I'm seeing a lot from sort of the propaganda mill that we have, mainly coming from what I like to call state media proxies, because let's just be honest, a lot of MSM mainstream sources are effectively proxies of the state. If you actually look into their finances and you look into how they're lobbying and you look at the people on their boards, you find out like, oh, there's a very big sort of financial relationship between them and the state that doesn't really make sense to exist. And the propaganda they push out is completely contradictory. And that's kind of what I pointed out when I kind of coined the phrase, Islam is right about women. It's not actually about saying anything bad about Islam or bad about women. It's just pointing out that, hey, wait a minute. People don't agree on these things, and these are contradictory ideas. And so we need to actually have a world where people can freely associate with the society that actually agrees on some level with morality, and let those moral systems compete so that we can actually find a good moral system. That's why I would basically call myself a Hoppian, actually, is because you could say that my dream of the United States is one that consists of 1,000 states and no federal government, of course. we could go the temporary minarchist route and just make it so the federal government, all they do is just enforce the Constitution. And then once we get people to realize that, hey, that makes things better, then we can just get rid of them entirely.
Right.
And so you need people to be able to freely associate with those who they agree with on a moral level. Because the reality is, there will always be, in terms of ethics, there's always going to be terrible people. Again, that kind of goes into the fact that those of us on the libertarian right are not trying to sell utopia. We know that there is going to always be thieves, there's always going to be liars, there will always be murderers, there will always be rapists, they will always exist. There are going to be people who just don't care about morality. There are going to be people who only think about themselves, they only think of themselves as the ultimate center of the universe, and they're just going to be crappy people. And that's unfortunate. We don't like the fact that that is how it is. But we also have to accept reality that, yes, that is how it is. That's just humanity. Human society needs to be designed for human beings, not for 300 IQ omnibenevolent aliens, which we are not.
Right. Well, apparently a lot of people who act as though the people within our state are those 300 IQ people who know so much better,
Well, yeah, I mean, if you want to go back to the socialism route, that's actually what I just mentioned. There is also a criticism of a lot of socialist beliefs. A lot of the whole, for instance, the knowledge problem of socialism, it would be fixed. Like, technically, communism could work if people had 500 IQ and we were omniscient and omnibenevolent. And we were basically robots that only thought about the hive mind at all times. But of course, we're not. And so when you try communism in practice, it doesn't work because central planning doesn't work. And human beings just can't do that. We think about ourselves. Right. And so and a lot of, I think, again, that's another reason why a lot of young people get sucked into leftist economics, because they kind of fall into the sort of moralistic fallacy of, oh, hey, if everyone was a super smart angel, then this could work. And if we all knew everything, then this could work. And they're like, well, yes, actually, if that was true, then it could work. But you're not an angel. You do not have celestial knowledge of everything at all times. You do not have a 500 IQ. You are a 97 IQ midwit. Too bad, dude. I'm sorry, and I hate to put it how it is. I hate to tell you how it is, but that is how it is. It's just not gonna work, bro.
Yeah. I've never really understood why, how people will criticize, libertarianism or, anarcho-capitalism or Austrian economics on the grounds of human nature, when I would say that, these ideologies are probably the most in tune with the concept of human nature. I know a lot of people argue over whether human beings are fundamentally good or fundamentally evil, but my personal take on it is probably that humans are fundamentally, selfish, and that probably selfishness I hate to sound like a Debbie Downer here, but it kind of manifests itself more frequently in probably evil behavior than good. But obviously, I think there are a lot of people out there who will try to do the right thing, and I think that anarcho-capitalism provides the best economic system for allowing those people to do that.
I think that kind of differs from person to person. Everyone, you're definitely right on. Everyone's naturally selfish. That's definitely true for basically everyone. And honestly, you can't really blame us for being that. That's the most logical way to be, because that's what would give you the highest fitness score in terms of survival, is you have to kind of watch out for yourself. So, of course, nature has kind of forced us in that direction. However, being selfish doesn't mean that we're not necessarily empathetic. I think that you have human beings walking around, and then there's different scales between humans who are empathetic towards others and humans who just don't care at all. And so we kind of do have multiple people walking around in a way. I guess I'm saying that we're not all equal in that sense. There's some of us who are empathetic and some of us who are not.
Right. Very true. So, I guess at this point, I kind of wanted to also, discuss the concept of the media. I feel like there's a lot that can be said there. So, I've noticed that, as far as the discourse between, the left and the right, it seems as though I've noticed that there's kind of a group. I personally refer to them as the 2D left, where you'll have people such as, CNN, these people on NBC, Don Lemon, Anderson Cooper, people who are obviously just ridiculous. We're not very
propagandists.
Good. Yes,
paid
exactly.
Propagandist shills, basically.
Right.
State shills, effectively.
Exactly. And then you'll have people responding to them. And you might have basically the 2016, 2017, Ben Shapiro, these types of videos. You might have the kind of
slightly better, but still propagandists.
Exactly. Yep. The X in all capital letters destroys Y, and just these things that are really just clickbait type videos. And then you might have, let's say, what I call the three-dimensional left, where you'll have people such as ContraPoint, Philosophy Tube, basically the bread tube, these people, where they present themselves as, perhaps, more of a response to that. They might seem as a lot more credible than these people on, CNN and such. Maybe to an extent they are, but
they are.
Right, exactly. And I think that it's, if somebody sees these videos, they might walk away from that thinking that now this is what the left is really all. This is, these are actually good ideas. And, and when these are placed against these, these Ben Shapiros and such, now this is where, the left truly wins. But what I like about, content that people such as yourself and a lot of your peers create is that they really meet these leftists on their own territory. So basically, I've seen, a lot of your videos, addressing, these bread tubers. So my question for you basically is, out of these bread tubers, who would you say is the worst, and why is it Vosh?
You stole the word Vosh right out of my mouth. So, yeah, unfortunately, of what I've seen, it actually honestly isn't Vosh, to be real. There are some that are worse than him, but they are lesser known than him, so I won't even mention them. But there are some bread tubers out there who are completely unhinged and are for basically murdering anybody with even slightly right-leaning views, and they don't differentiate between authoritarian conservatism or Austro-libertarians at all. They think that we are secretly all the same thing. And they're definitely out there, and they're definitely worse than Vosh. But I think in terms of the amount of influence and damage that they've done, yeah, Probably Vosh, because I mean, you may have seen it, which you can kind of still find on the internet if you look for it. You may have seen a video by Doomer Media, who's basically left the internet, on Vosh is unironically evil, and that kind of points out the main issue. In fact, it's such a main issue that a lot of leftists and liberals, like in the Destiny side of things, have realized that this is a problem, in that Vosh kind of pushes this ends justify the means mentality that effectively comes straight from Mao in communist China. And the problem with that line of reasoning is that you can basically justify anything and you have basically no principles. You don't actually believe in anything. That's kind of the issue with Vosh. If you watch through his content like I did, like watch maybe 80 hours or so, which is part of my life that I will never get back, you'll notice that he doesn't really maintain any level of consistency. He's totally fine with telling people to okay, well, we're going to vote for this policy that completely goes against everything else I've ever told you guys to believe in, but it screws righties over, so we're going to do it. And that's completely unprincipled. He doesn't really believe anything he's saying at all. And what it effectively comes down to is the whole idea that it's okay to use violence against others. He doesn't actually say it. He doesn't actually go down that route. It's the term stochastic terrorism. You may have heard that term before. So he doesn't actually tell them to do that, but that's effectively what his viewers walk away from. And that's, I think, why Vosh has aligned himself more increasingly with that side of leftism, of people who think it's totally okay to attack others. And they do it online, too, where you see this sort of camp of leftism. I won't name who it is, because when you name who they are, they'll just come attacking this channel, attacking my channel, attacking everybody. But there is a camp of leftism out there who their entire mode of being is just attack. They see someone that they disagree with. They don't try to engage on them on a logical level or use reasonable arguments or any kind of mature adult behavior. What they do instead is they just try to ban everybody. They just try to get them deplatformed, try to get them demonetized, try to wipe them off the face of the internet, try to dox them, send nasty letters and send thousands of boxes to their home. Basically, they just harass whoever they disagree with, and they no longer engage on a logical or mature level. And that's kind of the problem I'm seeing a lot with the left increasingly. And it's really just the far left. I don't want to impugn all leftists on this, because, of course, there are plenty of leftists that aren't terrible people who don't do this, but there is an increasing camp of leftism in the far left that does engage in this kind of behavior.
So basically just the appeal to force fallacy in full effect there.
Well, any fallacy, really. Once you've adopted the ends justify the means mindset, then fallacies effectively do not exist for you.
Right, exactly, yes. So very all sense there. And, speaking of Orwellian, I've noticed, I was thinking, that it seems to me that Julian Assange really is one of the very last real journalists left, in a sense. And I think that this is really a symptom of a much larger problem going on in journalism, that basically, I would say fundamentally, is that, the media has become highly corporatized, a victim of corporatism here. And while a lot of people will call out, a media's bias and corruption when it goes against their own personal beliefs, a lot of them are perfectly content with it when it supports that. I mean, for example, you don't see a lot of Republicans telling Fox News to be more neutral, or Democrats calling for CNN to be more objective in this sense. So why do you think the media is this way? And, how did it get there? And what can we do really to fix it?
Well, you kind of touched on it. It really is just corporatism. It really is just kind of state and corporate interests have been working together for so long that the corruption just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. But there's actually another really interesting thing about the mainstream media that kind of goes outside of economics that has more to do with the internet. So here's the thing about corporate journals. They're already obsolete. They are in a Wile E. Coyote moment. If you know what, for anybody who doesn't know what that means, Wile E. Coyote is a cartoon figure from kind of last century, who he would run off a cliff while chasing the Roadrunner, and he would not actually fall off the cliff until he realizes that he has run off the cliff. He has to look down effectively, and then he falls. And corporate journalism is actually already in that position. They are already obsoleted. And so what's happening is a lot of journalists, they effectively get laid off and they get rid of them because they're no longer needed. You can already do journalist's job better as an independent journalist on the internet. Everything that they used to do maybe 50 years ago is now effectively done better by people like you, people like me, people like Liquid Zulu, MRH Legacy, or even people on the left, like ContraPoints, whether you agree with her or disagree with her, is a better journalist than all of CNN. That I have to give to her, even though I don't agree with her view. She is effectively a better influencer than them and more effective than them, just as one simple example. And this creates a problem in corporate journalism because they're no longer needed economically. And so when their constituents, their investors realize this, what happens is they get laid off. They realize that most of these people are actually very incompetent. They don't really do anything or add any value. And because they aren't necessary anymore, we're seeing a really weird niche where the only corporate journalists that are adding value are increasingly the journalists who are less interested in truth, because again, you don't need corporate journalists to be in truth anymore because that's done better by independent influencers on the internet. The ones that add value now are the ones who are more willing to push corporate propaganda, the journalists who are more willing to push special interest nonsense are the ones who actually add value to these corporatist sort of cartels. And so as that kind of goes on, that's why we're seeing more and more and more that the mainstream media gets worse and worse and worse, because they're already obsolete. They've already entered a really weird area of the market where the ones that add value are the worst ones, because they're already dead. They're already off the cliff. And it's only the ones that look down and realize that they are no longer necessary that fall. If that makes sense. I just oversimplified a very complex topic that's going on, but that's effectively what it is.
Right, exactly. I mean, the way I see it, they're going to be in a great deal of trouble once the silent generation dies out. But
oh yeah, they are on life support by boomers.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I think a lot of this does come down to the state in itself. I mean, basically, I would say that people talk about, the government securing free speech, when in reality, I see the government in a sense as probably the biggest threat to free speech. I would say that, anarcho-capitalism would be a better means of preserving free speech than statism, simply because you would be taking away that mechanism for, corporatism there. And as a result, by removing the state, you essentially be putting pressure on these, media businesses to actually stop doing, the horrible way they've been doing it for many years now.
Oh, yeah. There's actually pretty good studies to suggest that people like free speech for themselves, but also make the mistake of wanting to take free speech for others away. And the answer to that actually is the 1000 Liechtensteins. But we actually have a proof of concept of that happened more in the early internet, because for people who don't know, a lot of times people mistake me as being a lot younger than I actually am. People think I'm like 23 or 25 or something, which is funny because people have been guessing that I'm 25 for the last 20 years. If you can guess, no, I'm not 25. I'm actually in my late 30s. And I remember the early internet. I was a part of like the mid 90s, early 2000s, early internet. And back then, free speech was effectively handled. I mean, by having tons and tons and little websites and forums where you would talk with. And in those individual forums, like Envision Board was the most common, where people would just kind of clone that. In those forums, you didn't really have free speech. Every little board had its little topic that it banned, but you could always find somewhere that had some level of free speech. So you could always find somewhere that you could speak what was off your chest. And the issue we're seeing now is that with corporatism, we're seeing the state play favorites into the businesses that they like. We're seeing more of the whole lobbying revolving door relationship, and that has actually caused a lot more in terms of big tech screwing us over. Another one is actually intellectual property rights as well, is a big reason why we're seeing a lot of the free speech online get sort of condensed into a few places, because you have a lot of these big techs, a lot of people don't realize, is that they maintain a lot of their monopoly by intellectual property rights, because you cannot actually make clones of certain things that they have, or otherwise the state goes after you. And for those who don't know, the Austrian libertarian system is very much against intellectual property rights, so that would actually solve that problem.
So that actually leads me to my next question about intellectual property. So, I mean, in this case, it's firmly established that anarcho-capitalism would go against IP laws because they are basically a threat. Threat to competition and can create a lot of the problems that we're currently facing. But some people will see that as a double-edged sword. It's an issue in anarcho-capitalism where it's not so much as straight across the board. I've noticed it seems as though some people are kind of polarized on this topic, and they'll say that some people out there creating art or coming out with some type of ideas, they should have some type of means of preserving that idea, or at least receiving the credit that is due for it. What would you see as a rebuttal to these people?
Well, in terms of getting credit where it's due, the actual incentives lie when it comes to creating something intellectually, like be it a video game or be it a drawing or whatever. The incentive is always to actually support the person who that came from, so that they'll make more. Like if some studio makes a video game and you like that video game, the incentive is to actually support that studio, so that way they'll make more of it. And we actually kind of already see this. And the funny thing is, leftists have realized this as well, is that you can effectively replace intellectual property rights with just sort of Kickstarter campaigns and whatnot. You can, if you got rid of intellectual property entirely, then what would happen is you'd say Steam. Let's just talk video games. That's video games is a really easy example that I'm sure a lot of people, especially the people watching this right now, I'm sure everyone's played video games before. So Steam, if intellectual property rights is gone, what you would see in Steam is you would just see download game. However, it wouldn't just be that. You wouldn't just see the prices getting replaced with download game on Steam. You would also have a tab for every single studio in game called support. And so instead of paying for games and then downloading them, what you would do instead is you would download games and then you would support upcoming titles. So there would still be money. You would basically have the buying games economy replaced by a invest in future games you would like to see economy. That's what Steam would effectively become a platform for distributing digital games, and would also become a platform for actually investing in studios you like. And that's what would most likely happen now. Leftists screw up this implementation because they are correct in that we're correct in that, yes, investing would effectively replace rewarding people for intellectual property based motives. However, where they screw up is they want the state to do it. They want the state to basically decide who it gets the funding for whatever intellectual property that they have in mind, be it scientific research or art or whatever. They think that it should be centralized in the state. And it's like, well, no, that's completely unnecessary. In fact, the market could handle that much more efficiently. And we kind of already have that. We already have Kickstarter campaigns. We already have it in place. It just isn't very big because we have intellectual property rights. So the money that people would spend on investing in future intellectual based systems or products effectively or whatever, that ends up going towards buying software and buying intellectual property items for themselves. But in the end, people still get compensated. That's the TLDR of it. Again, I just oversimplified a very complex economic system. But yes, in the end, people would still actually get compensated.
Right. I mean, as it is, all of these Kickstarter campaigns, I mean, they are very much dwarfed by, these larger corporations. So basically, one video of yours that I did, that might actually be my personal favorite, is the one about the fraternal societies, talking about, places such as Mooseheart and, all of that. The reason I like that was because I think it has a larger significance to it. Because when a lot of people will hear about anarcho-capitalism, they'll kind of dismiss it as, oh, well, you don't care about the poor. Everybody just has to fend for themselves. The homeless will all just die out. Beggars in the streets. There's no protection for people who are disabled or things like that. When in reality, it's not against any of that at all. It's just, the problem is that that's provided through a state, setting its own, rules, and then imposing them on the public is the real issue here. So basically, I guess, what would you say to people, who do believe that, the anarcho-capitalist is, opposed to these, people? And what type of solution would you propose to people who are currently, destitute or, say, well, they really can't provide for themselves in the situation? Because I know it's kind of a thorny situation and one that, communists, certainly try to deal with, but of course I would say they deal with it in a horrible manner. They try
to fix it with force, effectively, yes. And which is kind of silly because we already deal with that using force, just indirectly. In a way, communists are being honest. They're being clueless, but they're being honest on that. That one is a really complex topic because, obviously I know how we could do it through fraternal societies and mutual aid and benefits and whatnot. It is actually possible to privatize welfare. That one is a little bit difficult to simplify, though. I've been actually thinking about how can we simplify this to explain it to someone in 1 minute. And that one's actually not easy at all because it is actually a really complex topic. But the basic gist of it is that the problem with our current welfare system is that it doesn't really hold any kind of sense of accountability, and it requires force in order to it has no accountability because it's based on force. And that actually creates a very big problem in society because people who are on welfare, they don't really have any kind of incentive to improve the situation that they're in. In fact, they actually get trapped in the welfare system because the incentive from the state is to make people dependent on the system, which is why we actually have a big gap in welfare systems, like various different things that you can get on welfare for, like be it SNAP or TANF or Medicaid or whatnot have you. All of those kind of have a cutoff where you earn 25K now. Well, now you just don't get any of this benefit. It just kind of cuts off, and now you have a sort of hole in between those in the lower working class and the middle class. And what people don't realize is that the government has been aware of this problem for a very long time. They know it's an issue. They know that this incentivizes people to stay poor and stay on welfare, so why aren't they fixing it? And well, the obvious answer is because they don't want to fix it because it's a grift. That's exactly what they want. They want people to become dependent on the state. They want people to think that they need this system. But in reality, it's because the state can just steal as much money as they need to fund these systems. And they want people to sort of, in a way, it's effectively a indirect way of indoctrinating people with the religion of statism.
Right.
As sad as that is. And mutual aid, what that does is that it allows poor people to effectively pay a very small amount so that they get bailed out. Because mutual aid is basically, it's kind of a fusion between an insurance system and a welfare system, because there is some actual gratitude, there is some empathy that goes into mutual aid where a poor person can actually get help, because it's not always based on money. For instance, it can also be based on free association, like, oh, hey, you'd like, let's say just a religious mutual aid society, like let's say just some Muslims get together and they decide to help other Muslims. And one of the problems that screws us out of that is actually taking away freedom of association, because now people can maybe point to those and say, oh, they're discriminating against us. It's like, well, that's where their incentive is they want to propagate their ideology. And so they're helping people financially who have that ideology. And you take that away from people, and then you just kind of have these sort of people living these degenerate lifestyles where they're not really going anywhere in life, and they're just sucking off of government welfare, and it's not beneficial at all.
Right, exactly. In a sense, this push, against discrimination is almost synonymous with a push for collectivism, basically pushing everybody together into one, monolithic whole, really.
The push against discrimination it's one of those things that people will think about, and it works in theory because people don't like things like bigotry and discrimination and whatnot. Like, most people, everyone agrees that those aren't actually good. The problem is that when you try to legalize that with the backing of state force, any kind of anti-discrimination rule in practice ends up being the equity fallacy. It ends up being this idea that any disparate outcome must be the result of discrimination, which is false. There's hundreds of studies proving that to be false. It is a huge statistical fallacy and error in reasoning. And unfortunately, that's what anti-discrimination ends up being in practice. And we know that it ends up happening because within just years of anti-discrimination laws coming into practice, we had disparate impact standard, which is like, oh, well, if 80% of group A and 90% of group B, oh, well, that's too big of a discrepancy, so therefore you are guilty of bigotry. Which is not true. There could be hundreds of other reasons. There could be like cultural, there could be regional reasons, there could be just free choice reasons. There could also be just innate difference reasons, like with the case of feminism and men and women. Like, men and women do not always want the same thing. And so when you look at disparate outcomes between men and women, when we don't always want the same thing, well, of course you're going to see discrepancy there. And of course you're going to see, oh, well, that's discrimination. And then so you take those people's freedom away. But if they're freely choosing that, then that anti-discrimination rule actually results in, paradoxically enough, more discrimination because you're discriminating against people based on what they actually want. And it just ends up being a huge mess.
Exactly. I mean, when we have this type of equality of outcome, naturally, how are you going to achieve equality of outcome other than with force? And, when you use force, you're most likely going to be, in such an instance, you're obviously going to be discriminating to an extent there. Perhaps even more so through the state than there would have been otherwise.
Well, yeah, that's just kind of how it works. That's just a thing you can figure out with pure logic. If person A wants to eat grapes and person B wants to eat apples, and you've decided that the state decides for whatever psychotic reason that they must have equal outcomes, the most effective way to do that is to hold a gun to their head and say, okay, both of you are only going to eat oranges from now on. No grapes for you, no bananas for you, no nothing. You can only eat oranges. That is the most effective way to achieve equality of outcome when you actually have that in practice. And people don't realize that. It's the kind of the issue of forced-backed laws instead of free association-backed laws that you would get from a decentralized system of rule that ANCAPs and Austrians kind of push for, is that you have a lot of unintended consequences because your idea in theory is not always the same thing as it in practice, because the reality is their theories are wrong.
This type of egalitarianism, and it leads me to my next subject I wanted to discuss, which was the concept of hierarchies. We know that, in more of the left-wing anarchist ideas, hierarchies are considered a really big problem. Now, I've often said that, hierarchies, in themselves are not actually the issue here, but rather forces. And force can be used, independently of hierarchies. But there are certain people who I know will, try to respond to that with the fact that maybe so, but, hierarchies can certainly facilitate the use of force. So how would you respond to them and, try to persuade somebody who is convinced that, somebody being at a higher level than others is some type of, injustice or some type of exploitation?
Well, the most important thing when it comes to hierarchy specifically is to get people to understand that you can't actually get rid of hierarchies. Mm-hmm. Hierarchies will always exist. Even if you got rid of humanity, hierarchies would still exist in nature. And any interaction between two individuals with any kind of difference at all between them, even mental differences, even just one having a different desire than the other, will imply some kind of hierarchy because person A's desire may have a higher value than person B's desire. Like person B might want something that is harder to get than person A. And just that alone will imply some kind of hierarchy because it means that person B has to do more to get what he wants. And so that will just always exist. You can't actually get rid of hierarchies. Any leftist who says that we can get rid of hierarchies kind of goes back to what I said about 40 minutes ago with the left half. Their big scam is to basically push this sort of utopian idea of no scarcity, perfect equality. And the truth is that that is just not how nature works. There's no way to get rid of that. So what you have to do instead is think about, well, how do you resolve hierarchies? How do you resolve conflicts? And that's when you actually start getting into the thinking about the ethics behind economics, like argumentation ethics. I think you've talked to Liquid Zulu, I believe, and he kind of goes into a lot of that. So I won't go into it too much because I'm sure that if you've talked to Liquid Zulu before, he probably went on for that for like 50 minutes or something. But the basic thing is, the basic gist of it is that once you actually get into the ethics of economics, you realize that, yes, hierarchies exist, and recognizing they exist is important because you need a way to resolve conflicts. You need a way to decide who is the aggressor and who is the rightful owner of a private property. And if you don't have that, then you have a system that is effectively doomed to fail because you're not recognizing reality. You're not living in planet Earth anymore. You're living in some kind of weird, self-contradictory utopian concept that, again, people buy into because it sounds very nice if you don't think about it for more than 10 seconds, but it can't actually exist. And so I guess to simplify it is, when someone kind of brings up hierarchies, you point out to them, well, hey, how do you actually get rid of hierarchies if any interaction implies a hierarchy? And the fact is, when it really comes down to it, is that when you push a far leftist influencer, especially, to be honest about this, because I've seen tons of these discussions online, then they shift the goalposts and they go into, oh, well, we're just against unjustified hierarchies. And you're like, well, what is an unjustified hierarchy? And what is a justified hierarchy? And then they'll increasingly shift the goalpost on what that is. And what you find out is that a lot of leftists, one video I thought of doing a response to was one by Thought Slime, actually, where he attacked anarcho-capitalism. And he starts out by saying, oh, hey, ANCAPs like hierarchies, therefore they're actually secretly all fascists and whatnot. He doesn't specifically say it that way, but that's the basic gist of it. And so, okay, so I guess this guy's against hierarchies, right? And then about 7 or so minutes into the video, he then justifies, and we're also for stepping all over their NAP, and he shows people using violence. It's like, bro, violence is a hierarchy, you dingus. Violence is a hierarchy. And so that kind of just exposes the midwitism of Thought Slime. And unfortunately, this video has tons of likes. People actually don't realize how big of a contradiction that is. They don't realize that, oh, I'm anti-hierarchical, but I'm pro-violence. Like, bro, violence only works if one person has greater amounts of power than the other. So you just effectively admitted that your entire ideology is a lie. And they don't realize that, and it's kind of sad.
Which person is going to vet, if this is considered a natural hierarchy or an unnatural hierarchy. And, it's almost as though the person, making this decision would have to be at a very high place, almost within a hierarchy themselves. I mean, the alternative of, just everybody, having a say in it, I just don't think is, efficient or practical at all, which is why, I've often heard mutualism, for example. People, anarchists will pose that as some type of a reasonable middle ground, whereas apparently anarcho-capitalism allegedly goes too far. People will say mutualism. They kind of try to use that to lure in the ANCAPs. But really, I think the idea of, a society where every single business, whether it's the military, whether it's hospitals, every single institution is a workers' co-op. I don't think that that's, a practical idea. I don't think that that's, efficient. And in reality, just to actually even try to practice that, I feel like would eventually devolve into one person who's really the head and, essentially just, telling other people what to do. It would basically devolve into almost kind of an anarcho-capitalist society anyway, in the long run, I personally suspect. But basically, I guess what I'm going with this is what do you think of, anarchists trying to pose, some of their ideas as a more reasonable middle ground, with anarcho-capitalism?
I mean, I don't think certain ideas that try to find a middle ground are immediately bad, but at the same time, you have to point out specific things about them that are bad. Like, for instance, is there anything like specifically? That's when I start going to specific details. Like, well, what about mutualism is so much better? And then they'll say, well, da 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 da, and then you give them reason. Well, da 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 da. That's not incorrect. That's not actually correct. And so that's kind of how you have to deal with that. You have to deal with it honestly on a case by case basis, really.
Right. And, while we're really riffing on these, left-wing anarchists, I also wanted to speak on the concept of, private property. They make the distinction between, personal property and private property, obviously. And, we can talk, HOPA, the ethics of private property and things such as that. So basically, there's clear concepts within the left-wing anarchism about how, for example, rent is theft. Basically, the quote from Proudhon, property is theft, which I think is taken very much out of context. But basically, what type of rebuttal would you offer to people who insist that there is some type of concept of private property, which by its very nature is unjustified, as distinct from something which is their personal property, which could potentially be argued is a flimsy definition to begin with. What would you say to them?
What I say to them is that when you deny the existence of private property, you're effectively denying any kind of system of resolving scarcity. That's really what it boils down to, is that when you need to have private property in order to resolve conflicts properly. If you don't have private property, then if two people disagree with what they want, then how do you decide who gets the stick and who doesn't get the stick? And the answer is mob rule, effectively. There's actually there's a totally different economic system I read about once called participatory economics that you may have heard of before or not. And it's extremely dumb, actually. It's an idea where we completely get rid of money and you just democratically decide everything. And admittedly, for Pericon, that is a huge oversimplification just there. If anyone who actually believes in Pericon hears what I just said, they're going to flip out and be like, no, that's not Pericon. But effectively, it really is, to be honest. And their idea is we're going to democratically decide on every single economic decision. Like if there's a chair and 3 people are using the chair, then you vote to decide what happens on that chair. And the reality is it fails for the same reason that any kind of democratic system fails, because it's really just mob rule. And just because people agree on doing something doesn't necessarily mean that that something is a good idea. Like if you get 10 people to agree on murdering the 11th person, that doesn't mean that that's an actual justified ethical position to have. And so what you have with private property and money is that we've realized that we actually have a better way of resolving conflicts, of sort of, we effectively deny the aggression. We actually identify where that's coming from, and you need private property in order to decide who owns what first.
Right. It's the non-aggression principle in this case. And, I've heard, a lot of criticisms of the non-aggression principle. Some people will say it's kind of idealistic or some kind of a pipe dream. How do you think it could reasonably be implemented within, an ANCAP society?
Well, yeah. Well, again, that kind of goes back to what I said before. We're honest. We say that we're not actually getting rid of rules. We're not actually getting rid of police and rid of courts and whatnot. We're just privatizing it, because the big issue with the government in that case is it's not just monopolies, but they're actually very inefficient. It costs us a lot more than we realize, and the media and our educational institutions don't really teach this very honestly either. They don't really tell us that, hey, in the long run, all these government programs actually cost a lot more, often something like 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, 10 times more than they would cost us in the long run if they were just privatized institutions. So you're still going to have police, but they would just be private rights enforcement. They would just be basically private security.
And this actually kind of leads me to my next concept here. I want to talk about, a fallacy I've seen a lot, which is the appeal to authority fallacy. I know you spoke on this in your academic consensus video. So basically, what I've extracted is that, we need to ask what it is that these authorities are actually basing their findings on. because in short, it's not about what the people say, but about what the evidence says. And sometimes the evidence could essentially be, influenced by a lot of external factors as well. So basically, I definitely better to cite actual evidence rather than simply, well, so-and-so says as an argument, rather than, treating a person who makes such claims as some type of a godhead, for example. I mean, even if we take even somebody great like Ludwig von Mises, I mean, even he has some quotes about the necessity of the government, which I don't personally agree with. But, it's because I try to evaluate the ideas rather than the people that I have to look beyond that. So,
yeah, this is something that both me and actually Praxpen kind of agree on in a way, in that people who are not very bright should not really be involved too much in politics. Because one problem I see a lot, I'm kind of going on a tangent here, is that some bread tubers, not all of them, like you've got some bread tubers out there who genuinely have a brain in their skull. Like, for instance, Destiny and ContraPoints are actually both relatively intelligent people. But you also got people like Xander Hall, who are just dumb. And I don't even mean that as an insult. I just mean it as an unfortunate matter of fact of reality. He's not a very smart guy. Or Hassan Abbey, another one. He's just not very bright. He's not very bright at all. He commits numerous fallacies. When I was doing my video on Hassan Abbey, I didn't cherry pick at all. I just watched random content and like, oh, fallacy there. That doesn't make sense there. That's a circular argument there. You don't have to actually try to see anything wrong. You just have a brain and you will see that, oh, what he's saying doesn't actually make sense. And so, bringing back to what we were talking about, because of that, people who commit that error, they'll just engage in what you like to call intellectual laziness, when we kind of put our faith in people who aren't very intelligent. And what they'll do instead is they've actually come up with really weird reasons for why appeal to authority is actually a valid argument. And the truth is, well, if you don't actually understand these concepts, you really shouldn't be involved in politics. And that can come across as arrogant, but unfortunately it's kind of true. If you aren't well versed in reasoned thought, if you don't actually understand the concepts you're talking about, to give data and understand the data and understand where these arguments are actually coming from, if the extent of a person's understanding is like, oh, well, such and such says so, or this news anchor on MSNBC said so, and I'm just going to link to this opinion editorial article from MSNBC, and that's my argument. It's like, okay, well, that's cool. Thanks for wasting my time, because I can clearly tell that you don't actually know what you're saying. And that's kind of a problem. And we kind of understood that, honestly, in the early internet. To be quite frank, I know I kind of sound like an old man now, but back in the early days of the internet, it was a lot more well understood that just simply saying, oh, well, news says so, therefore true, it was a really stupid argument. I used to hang out on old Envision boards back then, like early 2000s, and people understood back then in the earlier days of the internet that, oh, hey, this kind of argument is dumb. You should cite the data, not just dude says so. And unfortunately, as the internet became more popular and you had smartphones, we had all the new friends and normies coming in, and the average IQ of the internet just kind of going down and down and down, further and further and further, until we kind of reached critical mass. And now the majority of people think that appeal to authority is a good argument. It's like, no, unfortunately, it's not. And in a way, I can see why a lot of people think that it's a good argument, because yes, if you appeal to authority, if you appeal to an expert opinion, there is in fact a good chance that expert is correct. I'm not denying that if you cite an expert on astrophysics for an astrophysics question, it's probably true. The problem is that when you get people debating these sort of deeper philosophical concepts and they're just citing experts, they don't actually know what they're saying. So what are you doing? Why are you two debating on something that neither of you understand? Why are you guys wasting your time like this? And I see this a lot on Reddit too. People engage in these 5-paragraph essays where all they're doing is citing sources, and neither of them really show any kind of genuine understanding of what they're talking about. And I could just ramble on about that, but it is a problem, and it is the lesser intelligent discourse of the internet, the fall of online discourse, you could say.
And that gets especially bad within economics too, where you tend to find, the experts in the field disagreeing with each other a lot more than you might in one of the harder sciences such as chemistry or physics. So you'll find a lot of people there, kind of just going back and forth. So you might say, well, Mises says this, well, Krugman says this, and it's like, in an area such as that, you could really get into some tricky territory.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the reasons I like Austrian economics so much, is because one of the key tenets of Austrian economics is that we try to approach it from the standpoint of reason and not just cite data that you don't understand. I mean, you do want to cite data, but you want to understand the data. And a lot of people will just cite things like, well, hey, look at this part of the graph, therefore natural monopolies. And it's like, well, what if the basis behind that turns out to be untrue? Which, spoiler alert, the basis behind that has proven itself to be untrue several times in the past. And then they're like, oh, but the graph says so. It's like, okay, I just explained to you that if X variable in this graph turns out to be something else entirely, and I just gave you 5 examples. Oh, but the graph says so. Okay, you don't actually understand the math behind this graph at all, do you? And the answer is no, they don't know. They don't actually know.
Oh, that's good. Very, very well said. But another video I noticed from you that I was just thinking about was the Whataboutism, and I feel like this is a pretty common example that is used too. I mean, this can be used, in, I would say, sometimes in legitimate ways, but also sometimes in completely illegitimate ways as well. I mean, this is often to me, it seems like it's just really a way of diverting attention away from some type of unjust behavior. I mean, even if you do successfully prove that the other party is hypocritical in some matter, and you might say, well, what about the time you did that? It still doesn't justify your own actions. You're not really even attempting to justify what you yourself have done. So I'm curious what your take would be, in response to what you think would be the best prescription, really, to deal with this type of argument when it's proposed.
So there's an interesting thing on hypocrisy that I've noticed, which is that for some bizarre reason, calling someone out on hypocrisy has become less and less of an actual effective argument. People just don't care that they're hypocrites these days. And so what you can do instead is you can actually instead point out the problem of hypocrisy, which is that if you are being hypocritical, it effectively proves that you don't really believe what you're saying. And the funny thing is, saying that you don't really believe what it is you're saying, you don't actually believe in any of these principles you're putting forward, that accusation in a roundabout way means the same thing as calling someone a hypocrite, but strangely enough, it's far more effective because it gets to the root of the problem. So what you can do instead is like, well, if you're doing X while claiming that X is bad, then that means that you don't really believe that X is bad. It means the same thing, but you're saying it in a way that forces them to acknowledge that they are completely unprincipled and that they don't really believe in these things that they're claiming.
Right. That's a good one too, because I feel like as far as, errors in reasoning go, I mean, that particular one is one that I think really can go under the radar, pretty frequently. So I think it's definitely one that, we should be definitely cautious of. Well, while we're just cycling through your different videos, the one that I was thinking of, I was watching probably most recently was the surplus labor value. So circling back to the left-wing anarchists, I know that, a big, part of that, one of the probably the most central tenets is the labor exploitation theory. And we've seen, Jürgen von Bombewerk, Karl Marx in The Close of His System is a great work on this, basically breaking down a lot of the issues with this particular theory.
So, Hoppe has a good one too. Hoppe has actually a really good lecture on on Marxist theory and exploitation, and how there is exploitation, but not in the sense that Marxists believe exploitation exists. And in my surplus labor value video, if you're talking about that, I oversimplified a very complex system when I talked about how much do you value your time. And this is actually something that Hans-Hermann Hoppe pointed out, is that the biggest problem with the exploitation theory that comes from the labor theory of value is that Marxians and really anybody who talks about socialism in that direction of the LTV, they have completely missed the concept of time preferences. It's just not a part of their theory at all. And that is a huge critical flaw, is that a lot of times the difference between a business owner and an employee trading their time, the difference is that the employee just has a higher time preference. The employee doesn't want to put in the year's worth of work it takes to actually build a business. And that's where the value is actually coming from. That is where the difference is seen. And because socialists just completely ignore time preferences, and they ignore the fact that time itself has value, and things like risk that comes with that time preference has value attached to it, they make the critical mistake of assuming, oh, that must be theft then, that the boss is therefore stealing from his workers, when in reality, no, what's you could also say is that the workers are actually paying that amount to their boss so that they don't have to put in the year or two of time to build a business. You could actually put it that way too. And because they completely miss that, they've seen exploitation in a system where it doesn't really exist. However, that doesn't mean that there is no exploitation at all, because a big problem and the reason why so many people are suffering is because it's actually very hard to build a business. It's a lot harder than it should be. And the reason for that, then you start asking the question, okay, well, why is that? Why is it so hard to start a business? And you start looking into it and you find out that there's tons and tons and tons of government, state regulations in place that are designed to prevent you from starting your own business. And that is where a lot of the exploitation is actually coming from, is that you are being prevented from actually striking out on your own. It's a lot harder than you think. Like just starting a restaurant, there's something like 15 different permits and regulations you have to jump through. So before you can even get started, you're almost going through 6 months to a year of just tens of thousands of dollars and government and state nonsense that doesn't even make sense a lot of times. And when you look into it, you actually find out that in terms of the lobbying and what goes on in Washington, you find out that the larger corporations are the ones who are pushing these regulations because they know it stops people from competing with them. And that's where the real exploitation comes from, is from state-backed force preventing you from striking out on your own.
And, I mean, some people will hear this and, they'll say that, they'll take it on a superficial level. They'll see that, a lot of the manual labor they see being done in these businesses is done by those who are paid less, than those who receive most of the pay. And so they'll think, well, how can this be justified? And in reality, they're kind of missing the bigger picture. And I wouldn't say that's even an accurate representation of what's happening anyway. As in in case of a lot of businesses, the business owner is the one who's actually doing a lot of manual labor. And we can look at a lot of, sole proprietor type of businesses as well. So basically, the issue here that I'm seeing is that they're just taking it on a very superficial level. They're not really recognizing the complexity that a lot of these businesses have, and that a lot of these entrepreneurs really have in establishing these businesses. And a lot of the time, these entrepreneurs, when establishing them, have to actually take, greater leaps than they would have otherwise just to get these businesses off of the ground, like you were saying. And I know, in fact, I believe it was Anglo-Libertarian. I was watching a video from him where he was breaking down, the labor exploitation theory in itself, taking the example of, let's say, somebody's building a chair, and, the Marxist might see that and say that the builder of the chair is being exploited because, let's say, he's, being paid a certain wage for, let's say he's being paid $10, and then the entrepreneur is selling it at, a larger amount, and then, he's pocketing the difference there. And in reality, when, Anglo-Libertarian broke that down, he was explaining that if anything, it's the opposite. I mean, the person who's, paying them, he's taking on great risk selling the chair. He doesn't know if somebody's going to be paying it. He could be losing that money. He also has to take the funds that he has, and they don't go directly into his pocket. He has to put that towards the business itself. So it just seems to me that they're taking a very, out of context, perhaps even deliberately to an extent, a very out of, small picture view of the situation itself.
Yeah, one thing that can kind of go on a tangent there is what they're really doing is they're committing a common fallacy. Sorry, that fallacy of people who, I'm actually partially deaf, so sometimes I mispronounce words, but whatever. What a lot of people do is that they have a tendency to blame symptoms rather than the actual problem. And so a lot of people, and this is where socialism actually gets a lot of sort of younger people on their side. The fact is that a lot of society is in fact suffering and feels like they're being exploited. And it's very easy to point to the symptoms of that exploitation and say that that is the exploitation. Now, the symptom of it is that a lot of people don't get paid very well. And so, okay, well, it's your boss's fault. And it's very easy to take someone who doesn't really understand the sort of intricacies of the economic system behind how businesses operate and how money operates and how the economy flows. It's very easy to take a young person who doesn't really understand how the real world works and point to, okay, it's your boss just not paying you enough, and that's the problem of your life. And of course, when you actually break it down, that's very foolish. And the real reason is because it's just harder to become a business owner yourself. It's harder to actually independently go grow your own apples and say you want to make an apple business. It's a lot harder to go out and like farm your own apples and then sell your own apples in an apple stand. And if you actually try to do that, someone from the government will come over and be like, hey, where's your permit? You need to pay your $15,000 permit to do this. And people don't realize that that's actually, that may sound like a really bizarre, over-the-top example that I just gave, but the reality is that's actually how it works.
There's really no exaggeration to what you just said. I mean, that's very...
There isn't. In fact, if anything, I under-exaggerated. In some cases, those permits can be hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions.
Right, exactly.
Like, especially if we're talking about intellectual property rights for the pharmaceutical and drug companies, the cost to create a sort of biosimilar product and actually sell it in the pharmacy and actually get your product out in order to compete with some of the other drugs out there, that can sometimes be tens of millions of dollars of fines and fees and various permits to actually get that going along. And then you wonder why our drug costs are so high.
Right, exactly.
So, it's actually worse than I pointed it out there.
Right, yes. As a side note, by the way, kudos to Woody Harrelson. I don't know if you saw him on Saturday Night Live, his monologue, where he broke down, in very, specific terms, especially on Saturday Night Live, which we all know is incredibly left-leaning, basically breaking down so basically we have this whole cartel of all the pharmaceutical industries. They come together, they use the state for their own effect, effect. Then they, have put all these meds out on the market. They're shielded from liability by the state, and we're all supposed to just believe that that's perfectly fine. And I know he's gotten a bit of a polarized reaction. A lot of the corporate media has, gone after him predictably for saying that. But, what he's saying is, just, as far as I'm concerned, the absolute truth. I don't know why anybody would disagree with that. But getting back to what I was saying, we've spoken on, kind of a lot of different fallacies here. So of all the fallacies that people have used against, your viewpoint, the Austro-libertarian, the anarcho-capitalist viewpoint, which one would you say is probably the most common, and why do you think this is exactly?
There's two big ones, the one that I've talked about and one that I haven't. I'm actually considering making a video on it. The biggest one, the most common one that I see is actually one that is both affecting culture and the economy. And if people who've watched enough of my videos probably know exactly what I'm about to say here, the most common fallacy is the equity fallacy. It is the idea that any disparate outcome must be the result of discrimination. And what makes that fallacy so insidious is it allows authoritarians to hide behind the veil of equality. They can claim that, we're for equality and justice, when in reality, in practice, it means taking people's freedoms away. It means imposing all these sort of state regulations and whatnot that don't actually produce equality at all, that actually harm the economy and actually create more identity politics and actually, ironically enough, cause different ethnic and cultural groups to hate each other more, if anything, because now they're looking at everyone's difference between each other, which these differences won't go away because a lot of the differences are voluntary differences. They're actually differences that they want to have. They're actually differences caused by like difference in religious values and different ethical beliefs. So they're always going to have these differences. And so when you implement the equity fallacy and you try to force it upon effectively the entire world, you're going to look at these differences and you're going to assume that they are discriminating against you. And you're actually going to, people get more and more insane. They actually get less social cohesion out of it. And it's really bad. It's bad for both the economy and it's bad for both us as people. And then the one that I haven't talked about yet, it would be what I like to call the collectivist fallacy. The people's tendency to assume that power is always collectivized. Like they'll look at collective identity. It's related to the equity fallacy. They'll look at collective identity instead of ideology. For instance, one really funny thing I noticed when watching a lot of bread tubers is that they, strangely enough, a lot of left, like far left progressives, they think the exact opposite is true in terms of big tech censorship. They think that big tech mostly censors them. They think that big tech is biased against them. And you're like, well, wait a minute. How could they possibly believe that that is true? That's insane. Everything that big tech does. And there's one way to find out this is who's lying and who's not, because like people on the far left say it's attacking them more often. People on the far right say no, it's attacking them more often. You can tell who's telling the truth immediately by which side is asking for more censorship. And of course, it's the progressives that are always asking for more censorship. But beyond that, there's a huge reasoning error behind it, which is that they are assuming that it's discriminating against them based on the identity of the people doing it. If you go in Silicon Valley, which I am very familiar with, because although I currently live in Oregon, I actually grew up in the Silicon Valley area. I went to high school with basically your standard like IQ 110, 115 on average, sort of one standard deviation above the norm children. And funny enough, I was one of the poorest kids in school despite being relatively middle class. And I'm very familiar with how they think. That's why I know what the fallacies of the sort of progressive mindset are, because I know how they think, and I've been in Silicon Valley a lot. And what progressives do is they see all these straight white males in charge of these big tech Silicon Valley corporations, and so they make the classic screw up. They assume that because they are straight, white, cis, heteronormative whatevers, that they must be making decisions that are in favor of straight, white, male, heteronormative whatevers. Right. And the truth is, well, no, they make decisions based on their ideology. And when you look at their ideology, they actually have an outgroup preference. People on the far left have something like a -19 in-group preference. And so you need to look at what they actually think, what their actual ideology is, and that is what they will actually act on. It kind of goes into themology and praxeology in terms of how people will actually act. And so that is where the true power dynamics comes from, is what ideology they're actually acting upon to implement. Whereas leftists just look at collective identity and they assume, oh, hey, X person is more likely to be in charge, therefore Y group being oppressed. And that's unfathomably stupid. It's demonstrably wrong. and that's kind of the big that's where the contradiction comes in, and that's why they're saying, well, we want more censorship, because they're not able, for whatever reason, to put two and two together and realize that, hey, wait a minute, the power dynamics are on our side. They kind of live in this sort of perpetual state of victimhood, and they don't realize it.
Exactly, yes.
And they do it because they look only at collective identity, which is kind of funny. Ironically, they're more bigoted than some of the people on the authoritarian right because of the way that they think.
I know. I mean, this actually reminds me, I've got to choose my words a bit carefully here, but it reminds me of a quote by O.J. Simpson. I know he caught some flack, and I'm not talking about the murders or anything, but I know he caught some flack sometime before that when he came out with where he said something along the lines of, I'm not black, I'm OJ. And frankly, I don't see that much of a problem with that line. I think that, look, obviously in the literal sense, he is obviously black, but what he's saying is I think he's pushing more for the individualism as opposed to, the collectivism, which we see, in full effect nowadays. As in, somebody is not essentially an individual anymore. They're part of a much larger group. And this has been maximized to, the greatest extent.
Yeah.
Right. I've often thought that, for example, if you want to know who's really countercultural, it's like if you can push an idea and let's say a massive, sales campaign, for example, if we can push, a lot of like things about a lot of these things about race, gender, sexuality, these aren't inherently, countercultural or anything. They're not, they're not niche ideas. They're being pushed. And if you look at any, ad campaign now, you're going to see these types of ideas, this type of, mentality being spread. Because, that's just essentially what's being marketed to people, and that's what they're going to go for.
Yeah. I mean, a simpler way to put that is that the logical conclusion of intersectional identity politics is actually individualism.
Right. Because
any identity group you can think of can always be multiplied and divided down to the individual further. And that's actually, I think Jordan Peterson is the one who kind of originally called this out as well, is that the big flaw of leftist identity politics is that they're completely arbitrary. They can be divided or multiplied in any way that you can think of. Any kind of identity group. For instance, you can take black people and then you could divide black people by black people who are lower class, middle class, upper middle class, and whatever. And then you can divide that further by black people who are Christian, who are not Christian. You can divide that further by black people who went to this school and then went to this school. And then you can divide that further. And then at some point you kind of realize, wait a minute, it doesn't matter that they're black. At some point, you're going to eventually realize that it doesn't, and that the same thing can be done for anybody. And so in a really weird way, the left is actually correct when they say things like race is a social construct. In a way, it kind of is, but just not in the way that they think that it is. The real problem is that it really comes down to the individual. Because you can do that for any group, for any race, for any person who belongs to any religion or any background. The more you get into intersectionality, the more you will eventually trace down to the individual, and there's no real reason why you wouldn't.
Right. I think probably one error I've seen actually is that I think they essentially underestimate, some of the left's arguments, I would say. They tend to look at it as if, their arguments are like Mike Tyson, just, beating up some baby, really. Whereas in reality, like some not even close, like the right has such an outrageous edge. And I think in reality, it'll be more of it's a bit closer than they might be making it out to be, really. So, for example, if we take, like these different concepts that they're pushing, such as male privilege, white privilege, things like that. Like I can personally understand why these movements exist. I can understand how somebody could be taken in by that. But I believe that these movements are fundamentally misguided because they're taking certain ideas and they're kind of taking causes for these concepts and essentially prescribing, the wrong solutions, and they're not taking things in the greater context either.
Well, yeah, that's where the collectivist fallacy meets the sort of the intersectional identity politics reaching down to the individual. If you want to talk about privilege, yes, if you look at it from the point of statistics, yes, if you are, say, white and if you are male, you are more likely to be in positions of power. But that doesn't actually mean that you are powerful for being a white and a male. And they kind of make the sort of error in judgment in that they think that power is averaged out somehow. They think that a white dude sitting in the Oval Office is somehow going to trickle down to the homeless white guy who is dying on the streets from starvation or freezing to death. And the reality is, no, he's still going to freeze to death in about 24 hours. That's kind of a fierce way of putting it, but the only way you can really simplify that and get the point across is by putting it in a kind of edgy way that I just did there.
Right.
There's no like a magical aura that Biden gives that sort of, we don't live in an MMORPG. Biden does not have some magic aura of protection that goes out to every sort of white guy out there. That doesn't actually work that way. In fact, Biden has, if anything, an out-group preference, so it definitely doesn't work that way.
Right. I mean, yes, and we can talk about him outright saying he's going to nominate people, for positions based specifically on their gender or on their sex. So we can, point to that as well as evidence of that. So basically, I mean, we've kind of addressed, a lot of these topics here. And, one I also want to talk about is basically just going back to the idea of the government, it's obvious that, money is wasted under the state. And many people who will agree with this will then go on to argue and say that, well, the state is still required as some type of referee and that the system simply just needs some tweaking and some reform so that will somehow cause the state to spend money in an optimal, orderly sort of way. And as a side note, I've always disliked the example of using the state as a referee because it's not the same thing. I mean, the state doesn't have to play by the same rules and they don't have to answer to the same higher-ups in the same way that a referee does. I mean, a referee can still be fired and challenged and, he has a lot more of a profit incentive than the state naturally will. So the state's going to... So basically, getting to the gist of this, what argument would you make to communicate to people out there that the state's going to...
It's actually a real simple one to say this, is to point out that a monopoly is never capable of being a fair referee. Right. That's actually the simplest way to put it. A monopoly cannot ever be a fair referee because why should they be? What incentive do they have to be? Exactly. I mean, and that's what you would ask someone when they bring that point up to you, like, why on earth would an organization that has a monopoly on violence be a fair referee? And the answer is they don't, of course. I mean, then you can get in further if they actually push back on that. And then you can actually go into looking into what the relationship a lot of corporatists have with Washington. And you can see that, no, Washington is not a fair referee. They base their regulations, they effectively sell their violence to other corporations. And that's how all regulations happen. The vast, vast majority of regulations that exist really exist to protect who has bought them. And in that sense, the government, in a really, really bizarre way, is just another business. That's what statism really is that the religion of statism is that we have decided that we are going to treat this one organization, the state, differently than all others. And we're going to point out that this is a problem in every other business, but for some reason when the state does it, it's a great idea. And when you actually look at the evidence behind it, you find out that no, the state does this business just like anybody else. They're effectively selling violence and larger corporations are buying violence, and that's how the regulations actually get implemented. It's one of those things where I could definitely see why people would be worried about certain things. Like an obvious one would be, oh, hey, we need regulation to stop, let's just say, to stop someone from damming up a river. Like what's to stop in a hypothetical? Like that's when you start getting into the unrealistic hypotheticals of sort of Austrian liberty. It's like, well, what if someone puts a dam up in a river and then everybody else can't drink very much? All the river dries out and then he's just destroyed everyone else's living because he's taken all the water for himself. And well, the answer to that is actually, in terms of private property, that would be considered a violation of the NAP. Because he's damaged the property of everybody else. So that case, he would actually be considered an aggressor, and people would be justified in fighting against that dam. And people often don't realize that private property rights it can effectively replace a lot of regulations. Like, for instance, tragedies of the commons are best fixed through people basically privatizing the commons, as well as holding it against those who damage others. Like, for instance, if someone went insane, like another unrealistic hypothetical scenario, well, what if someone decides to just pump poison into the air and they want to terraform Earth into Mars? Well, that means you're damaging the property of everybody else because everybody else's property now doesn't have air, which means that is a violation of the NAP. And in a really weird, twisted sense, I don't want to get into the global warming debate, but in a really weird, twisted sense, we actually have a better solution to global warming than what a lot of sort of centrist liberals are trying to push. They're trying to push like these little agreements, which then, of course, if you actually look into Paris agreements, nobody actually follows it. It's just a little paper that our leaders sign, and then they don't actually do anything. They don't actually follow through on any of their promises, and nothing actually changes. But let's say that global warming is objectively proven, and we know for an absolute fact that pumping these into the atmosphere is bad. Well, in a decentralized Austrian system with a privatized court, people could potentially actually just take those organizations to court and say, okay, well, now you owe us money because you're damaging the earth by doing this. And eventually it actually no longer becomes profitable for them to do that. And so we actually have a completely different way of solving it, which is a lot better than saying you're going to solve it by signing a little agreement and then not doing it. Because, I mean, of course, the state doesn't actually have to do anything that they agree to do, because, again, they have a monopoly of violence, and they don't actually have any incentive to be a fair referee. They have an incentive to pretend that they are going to be a fair referee, and they have an incentive to have the media tell people that they are a fair referee. And effectively, their incentive is to get people to worship the religion of statism and thinking that they need this fair referee. The truth is, this fair referee doesn't exist and never has existed.
Statism is inherently more utopian than, anarcho-capitalism, by far. Because whenever you point out the flaws of the state, they'll just say, "Oh, well, the state isn't ideal, but they just have to get their stuff together, and then they won't do it anymore. They won't be, as long as they just start taxing people at a better rate, as long as they stop doing all these problematic things, then suddenly it's there won't be any problem anymore." When in reality, obviously, it's not going to happen. They're not going to do that.
Oh yeah,
in their nature, they cannot do that. And it's just
you're kind of getting into Hans Hermann Hoppe's The God That Failed now, especially with states backed by democracy, is that if people think that, oh, we'll just vote for the right people in charge. Well, what if the state is working with the media to prop up two puppets who are both basically insiders, and they've already agreed beforehand that no matter whether it's blue guy or red guy getting in office, they're basically going to do the same thing. And then, of course, the punchline of this joke is that this isn't a hypothetical scenario at all. This is literally how the United States is operated.
Right. Exactly. Now, that is very much how it seems to go. So, I guess just wrapping things up, what would you say is the best? What would you say is the best way forward for the anarcho-capitalist movement? What would you prescribe to people out there? What should they do in order to actually bring our society closer to that as an actual reality, rather than just speaking about it in a hypothetical sense?
So our biggest problem right now, this is just for a libertarian ideology as a whole in the libertarian right, not just Austro-libertarians. This actually applies to sort of Cato-minarchist libertarians as well, is our big problem right now is that we do not have digestible arguments. Is that the problem is that too many people are indoctrinated into sort of this increasing leftist progressive ideology because it's being pushed in very easily digestible ways. This is actually something that Destiny, who I'm not even sure if he can be called a leftist anymore, he's kind of accepted the fact that he's more of a liberal at this point, because he's been, there's some drama, but to get into it, he's realized one of the things that he does very well is that he takes very complex talking points and makes them digestible for other people. And so what we need to do is we need to take a lot of our concepts and make them digestible. We need to find ways to actually make convincing, good arguments without compromising on our principles at all. And that's something I think a lot of those of us in the Austrian camp of libertarianism, we don't do a very good job of doing it. We're just not that great. For instance, Liquid Zulu. I like Zulu, but sometimes Zulu goes too hard on the Austro-Mises babble. And he's correct when he's saying these things. He's right. But the problem is that if you're not familiar with, if you haven't read Rothbard, sometimes some of the things he says will not make sense to the average person. He's correct, but it's not digestible. And that's what we need to do better at. We need to be making ways to find arguments digestible. Like one thing you might notice if you've watched videos on my channel is I try to make the arguments digestible so that the more traditional conservatives can understand them. I'm trying to basically reverse the sort of, people often say that there's a pipeline between libertarianism and sort of like trad conservatism. And I'm trying to show that, hey, that pipeline can go both ways. We can make the reason why so many people go into the more traditional conservative mindset is because a lot of libertarian concepts are genuinely difficult to understand. And so we need to make them more easily understandable effectively. And I think not enough libertarians think about that. We worry too much about being correct, and we forget the human understandability element that goes into being correct. It doesn't matter if you're being correct if people don't know what you're saying, basically.
Exactly, yes. To the average, to the layman, if they're hearing these, complex economic jargon, it's not going to mean much to them, and it's not likely to actually persuade them to actually, implement some type of change in their own daily lives.
Right. That's why I try to emphasize the issue of regulation, that a lot of regulations stop you from starting your own business, of kind of pointing out like how, hey, this system could actually immediately improve your livelihood if we just pulled back a few things of the state, which means that, unfortunately, in practice, I do acknowledge that even though it's not the most ethical thing, in reality, just because it's probably our only path to victory, we would probably have to go through a minarchist phase and convince the conservatives to be more minarchist. And honestly, it's not the greatest, but it is actually a good strategy.
Right. Yes, exactly. I myself personally, in the past, often vacillated between, small government, no government, until I've eventually wound up where I am now, and believing strictly in, the latter here. So basically, in this case, I think, you've really certainly touched on a lot of these, great topics here, and I think you've laid out a good blueprint for what people can do as far as improving, society here. So in that case, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for coming on MentisWave, and, to everybody out there, thanks for tuning in. This has been Morgan Meets the Eye. Make sure to follow both MentisWave and myself on social media. Subscribe, comment, and above all, keep asking why. So everybody out there, have a good one. Bye-bye.